Hey everyone, welcome back to Undivided Live. I'm Lindsay Crane and I head the content and community teams here at Undivided. Today we're revisiting one of the most important foundations of special education, FAPE, LRE, and the IEP. What does a free and appropriate public education actually mean in real life? Who decides what appropriate looks like? And when it comes to the least restrictive environment, how do we navigate the gray areas, especially when placement conversations get complicated? To break it all down, we are joined by Dr. Sarah Pelangka, BCBA-D, special education advocate and owner of KnowIEPs. She's here to give a clear, parent-friendly overview of your rights under the law, what FAPE and LRE really mean, and what to look for in an IEP so you can advocate with confidence. Let's jump in.
So Dr. Pelangka, if you can first sort of give us an overview and define FAPE and LRE and explain why they're essential for parents to understand, and then we'll dive into each.
Yes, so FAPE and LRE, probably the two biggest acronyms that we all should be familiar with, right? So FAPE stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education. It's, like the main component of the law, and it really allows, students that require special education to access public educational systems just as everybody else, right? And so I know we're going to kind of delve into each letter in a bit, but that's kind of in a nutshell what that refers to. Pre-IDEA, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And a lot of our kiddos were institutionalized way back when and or kept out of, a public school setting. So FAPE really protects our students in assuring that they can and will have access to public education. And LRE, part of the law as well, least restrictive environment, refers to basically the fact that all students should have the right to be as close to, general education population as possible while maintaining progress. So I know we're going to kind of get into that more too, and what that hierarchy looks like, and really delve into LRE.
Right. Supports, access, progress.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just going to jump straight into it. We're going to start with FAPE, and I'm just going to go straight for the $1 million question, which everyone always laughs about, but we're going to talk about the A in FAPE. So what does appropriate mean?
Well, if I may, I'm going to do F, P, and E first, and then we'll go back to A, because A is the most subjective, right? And so I feel like the other three are more objective. So free is free. So again, that means that any student, irregardless of their abilities, has the right to free education. They should not be required to pay to be educated. Public is public education. So again, all students, irregardless of their abilities, has the right to attend and access public educational systems. They cannot be, denied access based on their, labels or what have you. And education is education. So again, I feel like they're kind of redundant in that respect, but they have the right to be educated. They can't be institutionalized or kept out of the educational system because they are quote unquote, incapable of learning or, have too significant of a delay. Any student, irregardless of their abilities, has the right to be educated and have access to education. Now, appropriate is everyone's least favorite word, I think, within the law as a whole, because it's so subjective and it's changed over time. Andrew F., obviously, I think the most recent really put some clarity to it and made it become meaningful progress. But it really is that students have to have access to what is appropriate for them and their needs, and that the education that they're accessing should now provide meaningful benefit, but be appropriate to where they're at, be ambitious and challenging enough to promote progress, and just that it's, appropriate for who they are. It needs to be individualized and ensuring that they're able to progress, as they're moving through their education.
And who determines what appropriate means during an IEP?
So the whole IEP team, right? So there's pieces to the law that state, and again, after certain case law has come out, that it needs to prove meaningful benefit. So I think that's really the key lingo when we're talking about that A, that appropriate piece are these goals providing meaningful benefit, or is this program or this IEP as a whole providing meaningful benefit to my child, if you're the parent in the room, right? If they're writing goals that are, like, let's say the baseline for whatever the goal is 65% and the annual goal is set for 80%, more than likely that's not super meaningful progress for a year's time, right? So looking at things like that, or if they're writing a goal for a skill that just makes no sense and it's not going to be meaningful for that person's future, or something that they could learn at home, like, learning how to read a menu, for example. Is that something that's meaningful, especially if the student is, say, 10 and they're not like in an adult transition program type thing? The goals need to be meaningful in a variety of ways, and they have to prove benefit for that child at that time, or within, the timing that they're in terms of like their age and their grade, right? Like, it has to make sense for that student, they also should help guide that student to their ultimate goals. I think last week you talked about the vision statement, and I'm a huge proponent of that as well, and making sure that all of the IEPs include, just that vision for that child. And so the goals should kind of be those building blocks year after year, as far as getting them to reach those ultimate goals. And so they need to be meaningful in that respect as well. And of course, working to grade level standards all at the same time. And so all of those are pieces to the A, right? Like, is it appropriate in all of those ways? And every person in that room should be able to ensure that it's appropriate, but unfortunately that often doesn't happen. And so parents need to be kind of on their toes and make sure that they're aware of what that A means, and holding everyone accountable.
And and there's a lot to dig into within that. But what doesn't it cover? I guess we should say that as well. What doesn't FAPE cover? As far as like best, is it, is FAPE about maximizing your child's potential, giving them, the best that you can find in education? How do we define that, or have any kind of boundaries in this super gray area?
Yeah, again, I think it's really hard because there's still subjectivity, right? So what happened is it went from like a de minimis education, so just making sure that they have access to something, to be quite honest, is really what it was, to meaningful education. And so meaningful does not mean best. And it's really hard for parents to hear that, right? And so on occasion I'll get clients, or you'll hear parents like, I want everything, the moon, the stars, and everything in between for my child. And of course I'm a parent too, and I want that for my children too. But at the end of the day, the districts aren't held to that standard. They aren't held to provide the absolute best education, because they aren't held to do that for any child, right? So we like to think that we're sending our kids to school, gen ed or special ed, and they're getting the best education out there, but they're not. Maybe someone is, but every student isn't being afforded that opportunity. So that is kind of the reason why we can't argue that our kids should have that opportunity, if that makes sense. What is required is that, all children under the law have access to meaningful and beneficial education, and that they're making progress and they're working towards closing that gap. The law doesn't say the gap has to be closed, right? That's another thing that I think is hard. Parents will often, go in and say, well, my kid's 2 grades behind, the gap needs to be closed. And it's like, well, the law doesn't say that that's our job. The law says we need to ensure your child is progressing, and that they're progressing at a meaningful pace, and that, they're skill building. But it doesn't say that their job is to completely close the gap and completely catch them up to their same age peers, right? And that we have to provide the absolute best education out there.
And the P, we actually had quite a few questions that came in before the event, just wanting that clarification for public. They said, can this, is there any relevance of FAPE to private school or homeschooling? So I just wanted to clarify, for you to clarify that.
Yeah, so in the state of California, no. Private schools don't fall under the law because they're private. And so homeschools in the state of California fall under the private school kind of realm. And so they don't unfortunately, actually had, it's called a step meeting because it's a private school and they don't have IEPs. But anyway, it was a student, and long story short, he was just referred basically to be on home hospital. And the school came back and said, we cannot do that. We don't have the capability to make that work. So he can no longer continue at the school. And you can't really hold them to FAPE or IDEA because they're a private school. So they aren't held to the same law and the same standards, unfortunately. So for parents who are interested in private schools, it's always recommended to do your research, because some private schools are willing to provide accommodations or work with the family and do what they can. Like this family, for 6 years he was there, and they had a whole, what we would kind of refer to as a 504. They allowed an aide to come in, they gave him extra textbooks. So, but then it usually does get to a point where they just don't have the resources, right? They don't have a special education team, they don't have the providers. So yeah.
Got it. And at the end of the IEP, the admin should make an offer of FAPE that's written into the IEP document. How can parents review that IEP and assess for FAPE? What do we need to look for?
So at the end of the IEP, FAPE is discussed. And basically, I mean, the IEP as a whole is FAPE, right? So there's like two kind of prongs to FAPE. There's procedural and there's substantive. So the procedural stuff, if you're looking at if FAPE is being met, is just all the kind of almost like logistical, did they provide a copy of parents' rights? Did they hold the IEP by the due date? Did they, kind of dot all their I's and cross all their T's, if you will? Is everything kind of documented correctly in terms of the paperwork? Did they send prior written notice if those were required at any point within the year? Those would be procedural violations to FAPE. And then substantive violations would be like, is it being implemented properly? So now we have this paperwork, we have this legally binding document that says, for example, the child is supposed to receive speech and language therapy for 30 minutes a week, and then parent comes to find out that he hasn't received it for the past 3 months. That would be a violation of FAPE, right? So also, if there's no data, like we have all these goals written in and it says they're going to be measured by work samples or, records or whatever, and then they can't produce the data, that's a violation of FAPE, because that basically implies they didn't work on the skill, right? Violation of FAPE could be, it could go either way, that they're offering a too restrictive placement or they're offering a too less restrictive placement, right? So, and then parents can go back and say, that was a violation of FAPE. You should have known my child needed more support. Or you didn't allow him enough time with gen ed based on, his abilities and where he's at. So FAPE can be violated in any which way.
So you can agree, because again, we had a lot of questions about this from parents. You can agree to that IEP, everyone signs on. So you like the way that it looks. And if it's not carried out after that, then that is a violation. It's not something that lives within an IEP meeting. If it's not carried out, that is then a violation of FAPE.
A violation of FAPE, yes.
Right.
It did not uphold what was agreed upon.
Right. And you talked a lot about progress. So, if a child is regressing or they're not making progress, it's obvious it's not so black and white, right? We can say, though, if they're not making progress, it can be used a lot of ways. One will lead to the discussion we'll have, in a minute about LRE, but is that considered a violation of FAPE if your child isn't making progress or they're regressing?
I mean, not necessarily, right? Because the team could be doing everything that is written into the IEP. They're providing all the services, they have all the data, they're showing you that they're doing it, and it's not working, right? I mean, it's not always the case that, someone isn't doing something they're supposed to be doing. And it's so in that case, it's not a violation. It could imply that something within the IEP isn't FAPE, if that makes sense. Like something is amiss or something needs to be changed because we've been doing it for, 7 months. And unfortunately, we're not seeing, he's plateaued or he's regressed. So we need to come back to the table and revisit, the IEP as a whole.
Got it. And so, like I said, this is sort of the perfect segue about LRE, or least restrictive environment. So how does that fit into FAPE? I mean, first, is LRE only about placement and where our kids are learning?
So least restrictive environment, again, specifically refers to basically how much time is spent with the general education population. And so in that respect, because I know you're saying, does it only refer to placement? I mean, I guess, yes. I think one thing that I hear a lot in meetings is like the denial of a one-to-one aid because it's too restrictive and it wouldn't be the kid's least restrictive environment. And an aid is like a service, it's not a placement. So I always use that as an argument to deny that like rationale, like it's supposed to be like a service within a placement. And so you can't deny an aid because it's too restrictive, right? So if the student is in a gen ed class with an aid, they're still in a gen ed class. They're still with the same population of peers. We're not removing them from that population, if that makes sense. So when you look at LRE, the hierarchy, it's specific to really the placement or the location of where the services will be provided, right? So if a student is, pretty much fully mainstreamed within a gen ed class, that would be like the top of the tower. That's I always say like most least restrictive, which doesn't always sound like it makes sense, but and then you kind of go down from there, like, a gen ed class with some pullouts, and then a, SAI class time, and then just all day SAI class, and then SAI schools or county schools, non-public schools, and then home hospital and residential, settings. Obviously you can be in a gen ed class and have like push-in supports, but again, that's not taking away the percentage of time that the student is with their gen ed peers. So that doesn't really change LRE per se. And, if you look at that percentage on an IEP, that's why it's there, right? Because it's reflecting LRE. So what percentage of the day is the student with and without their gen ed peers? So whenever services are pushed in, that number doesn't change. It only changes when they're pulled out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I know we've touched on this before, but what is the significance of that percentage? I mean, you're saying it goes towards LRE, but how can the district look at that percentage? Can that affect placement?
It can. So it's like 51-49. So whenever that number goes above 51%, then the student is designated as an SDC or SAI, basically a special day class student. So that's kind of more, I would say, of something parents tend to need to look at when it's elementary school, because then when you're in middle and high school, it's all kind of wacky because there's multiple classes. But like resource pullout isn't a thing after elementary school, basically. So if you're in a resource model, you can only be so if you're 49% or less time in special SAI class or SAI minutes. Once that number goes above 51%, resource is no longer an option, and you would be moved to an actual SDC class. Because the higher percentage of your day is spent with a special day or a special ed teacher versus a gen ed teacher, or, the same thing can be said for students. A higher percentage of your day is spent with special ed students versus gen ed students. So that would no longer be considered the least restrictive environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's important because some parents might not even really pay attention to that. And then it does have relevance. So, make sure it's like all the parts of the IEP that maybe you skim over. Some of them have a lot of importance. Many, everything has importance. But some of them have hidden importance, I guess, or something a lot of people don't talk about. And when you were going over that hierarchy, I do have a question, because some people talk about LRE and say there's only one LRE, which is a general education classroom at your home school with supports. And other people and many districts say that least restrictive environment is defined for each individual child. So which one is correct?
So least restrictive environment, again, refers to the environment in which, the student is placed and they're making meaningful progress and educational benefit. I think it is confusing because it's the least restrictive environment possible is, again, the general education class, because what's considered less restrictive is what's closest to the general education population. But that LRE is dependent on each individual student and their needs. So at the end of the day, hopefully at least 1% of their time is spent with the gen ed population. Obviously, that's not the case once you get to like non-public schools and below. That's why those are the most restrictive placements. That is like the bottom of the hierarchy. There is no accessibility to gen ed at all, right? So that's a huge decision. If you're saying we're recommending, you know, this student be in a non-public school or home hospital or what have you, parents have to have a clear understanding that that means like 0% of their day is spent with the general education population. But that is part of LRE. It is an option. And that may in fact be that student's LRE at any given time, depending on that individual student's needs, right? So again, I had an IEP yesterday. This kid has been suspended 3 times within the last 3 weeks. And the most recent was pretty intense. Police recall, there was assault on a student. And he doesn't feel good about it either. So it's not just looking and considering the other student's safety. It's like, is it of benefit to him to keep sending him back to this big giant public school, knowing that he knows he can't regulate right now, and he's feeling guilty about the behaviors he's engaging in, and he doesn't understand right now why he can't, you know, regulate himself. It's not, and he doesn't feel good about it, and it can only continue to get worse potentially. And are we willing to risk that, right? Are we willing to potentially see this kid become even more, you know, making more suicidal statements? He's also already become suicidal. In those situations, it's very likely the case, and the argument can be made that it is no longer that student's LRE, and he needs to go to a more therapeutic setting where he can get the help that he needs. Does that mean that that's going to be maintained as his LRE? No. Ideally, the goal is always to bring a student back to, you know, that gen ed population, but there are occasions in which it's literally not safe. And at this time, a non-public school is his LRE. So it is based on each individual student's needs.
The default, or that's where you start. And then you are looking at each child.
That's where the discussion starts, right? It doesn't, I mean, technically, an argument can be made that every student starts in a gen ed class, but there are kids who start preschool and they aren't in a gen ed preschool. So there are occasions in which they have not yet been in a gen ed class, but that's where the discussion always should start. It should never start here. It should be, okay, let's start with the gen ed class. Do we think, looking through this IEP, that these goals can be met and these services can be provided and the student can make meaningful benefit in a general education class? You know, yes, great, that's, you know, his LRE. No, okay, why? And let's look at the next level. And it should go step by step, right? It should never just start down here, those conversations, but the conversation does have to be had.
And I do want to touch on the systemic issues with that in just a moment, because as you know, you and all the, you know, many parents know that it is, you know, a huge issue starting there at the bottom. But I want to touch on that in a minute. I want to follow up on, you know, really talking about these placements. If your district sends you to maybe a special ed classroom in a school that's farther away, it's not your home school, does that impact determination of FAPE? If a family says, you know, we don't want to go further away, we want to be at the home school, I mean, is that a valid conversation to have in the IEP around FAPE?
Yeah, I mean, it is, but I think a couple things. So one of the problems is that obviously there are less students that require special education than there are general education students. So not every campus has every single program option, right? And so the main reason why students are placed not at their home school is because the home school doesn't offer what their LRE is, or what, you know, has been determined to be their FAPE. And so they can't attend their home school because the team has agreed that, you know, student needs, let's say, an autism structured, you know, autism class, and that's not at the home school. However, there are other occasions in which the homeschool does have the program, but there's no space. And so that is a different situation entirely. And I definitely encourage parents, you know, to push for that, because I mean, it's huge. Like my kids personally, I mean, they're gen ed, but they don't go to their homeschool because we were already on a transfer. And I was actually just thinking about this last week. I'm like, oh, we don't have a lot of play dates, and that's not fun. Like, because all their friends are all the way across town, right? And so we can't just walk outside and see their friends from school. And that's so huge for all students, any student. So yeah, like I always tell parents to push for that. There are ways for schools to get waivers to have, higher caseloads or more students in their class. It's not ideal by any means, but it's possible. But yeah, if it's your home school and they have the placement and the program offered there, definitely push for that. And that's a huge reason. And socialization and social emotional well-being are part of, FAPE and your academics. Like, it's not just academics. It's part of everything is part of, the student's education. So imagine how much more meaningful their social experiences would be and can be if they are at their neighborhood school, right?
Yeah. I mean, my daughter, it was the same situation. We would go to our park and none of the kids in our neighborhood were at our school because we were actually, and when she was young, right, we were pushed to a special ed program. And so we were not allowed to go to our home school because of that. And yeah, it was already a hard situation. Social, a lot of our kids might have issues, it's difficult to socialize anyway and to make friends. And then when you kind of take the environmental piece out of it, where they're not walking outside and recognizing their friends, or, it's even more difficult. One more layer to consider. It's really important. So everything we were just talking about with Gen Ed, just to clarify, that LRE is not a legal guarantee for a Gen Ed placement.
No.
Right.
Yeah, the law doesn't say, the law is not least restrictive environment is general education, and all students that require special education have the right to general education. That is not what the law says. It's based on each individual student's needs because they have to be making meaningful progress.
Yeah. And, you touched on behavior, and, we definitely, it's a big question for a lot of parents, obviously, especially talking about LRE and what does that mean when behavior comes into play. We had some parents asking about, can we be denied, for a Gen Ed placement because of behavior? And then we had this specific question that actually really, from a parent, Stephanie, that reminded me a little bit. I mean, I have no idea her situation, but of the story you just told. And Stephanie, she asked if a district can force a parent to send their child with a mental health disorder to a residential school because they are a liability to the district.
Sorry, my phone is ringing. Hopefully you can't hear that. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So Stephanie wanted to know, she asked if a district can force a child to send their child with a mental health disorder to a residential school because they're a liability to the district. And you could probably ask that for a lot of things, right? To say for any child, like, are they a liability? We're going to send them to a county program or somewhere else. Can I do that?
Yeah, I don't really know that I understand the question in its entirety, but I'll respond to it the way I'm interpreting it. I mean, obviously my first instinct is the answer is no. I mean, there's placements in between public school and residential, number one. So I'm not sure if they had considered a non-public school. A residential treatment center is obviously the most restrictive option, and it requires a lot of, like, it's pretty hard, and it should be, because it would, you're sending the student away not only from the school, but from their home. They would be living there. And there's a whole assessment on top of assessments that are required, to put a referral in. The other thing, to note is in the state of California, if a student has any history of elopement or being a runner, then automatically they would be placed out of state because California has no locked facilities. And so that's big, too. And oftentimes families aren't aware of that. And so their child, more than likely is going to be placed out of state if it's a student with pretty significant behaviors, because most of them try to flee. Saying that a student is a liability to the district, I'm not sure I understand that part. I mean, the district is responsible for the student. And so their job is not to determine whether or not a student is a liability, as their job is to make sure that they're supporting that student's needs. So that's kind of the part that's throwing me off. I don't know if that's referring to the student putting other students in danger or putting the staff in danger. And so they're feeling like they're liable for the other student's safety. But at the end of the day, he's a student too. And so they're responsible for his safety and his well-being. And so what they should be doing is, calling IEPs. I don't know the history of this student, but calling IEPs to ensure that FAPE is being offered and everything on the IEP is being implemented. And if it's not working, is there anything else that can be tried? You know, does he have intensive individualized counseling? Does he have RAP services? Does he have a behavior plan? Does he have all those specialists seeing him, and how regularly? And is there an aide that needs to be there before we look at things like a non-public school? And a non-public school should definitely be tried before a residential treatment center. So, yeah.
Well, and in what cases is a non-public school? I mean, we were obviously talking about an example, you know, with residential placement, but what cases is a non-public school considered the least restrictive environment beyond, you know, I know we just talked about behavior, but, you know, it could be schools for autism or learning disabilities, ASL, you know, or behavioral challenges.
I mean, personally, non-public schools are very tricky because they have a little bit more flexibility in terms of like the qualifications of the staff that work there. So yeah, it's just parents have to be really careful of that, and making sure like all the teachers are fully credentialed, and, you know, the staff that are there are experienced in supporting the population that they serve. And that, I think I gave you the example when we spoke last week, like I have a client who's being referred to a non-public school strictly for behavior. And we have this meeting with this non-public school that they're referring the student to, and they have no behaviorists on staff, like no RBT or BCBAs. And when I asked, okay, well, if a student is being referred there for behavior, like what evidence-based strategies do you know, because I want to know. I don't believe that letters are super important, but come on, you know. And when the answer is like, we're trained in how to restrain, and we're, you know, CPI trained or PROACT trained, whichever one, it's like, well, that's a red flag. So you want to make sure that because then it's like, okay, so you're basically telling me you're going to support this kid because you know how to restrain him, and he's probably just going to get restrained every day and then go home, right? That's not okay. So being mindful of like who's providing the services, what their level of expertise is in supporting the population, what their background is as far as training, what curriculum they're using. They aren't, you know, necessarily held to the same standards as far as curriculum. When I think non-public schools could potentially be an LRE, I would say definitely with more extreme, like significant mental health needs where there's more of that therapeutic need. I've seen a lot of success with certain schools actually, and students go back to like public school, and it's been amazing. Potentially, you know, if it's extreme outward behaviors, there could be a need and it could work and be meaningful. And also the opposite end of the spectrum, like there's like 2E kids where they're twice exceptional, and you know, and or just students who are bored in the public school system, and it's just not working for them, and they're not really learning at the pace that they could be and with the rigor that they could have access to. And there are some great, you know, non-public schools out there that serve specific populations like autism or, you know, learning disabilities. And they have, you know, great programs and awesome curriculum. So for me, that's kind of the two realms that I see it working and being most effective.
And Stephanie she said she wanted clarification. Is there a law stating how much time on a bus is reasonable when busing to another school? So if you've chosen another school or you're being sent to a different school from your district, even public, is there a law stating how much time on a bus is reasonable when busing to another school?
That's a good question, to be honest. I don't know if there's a specific law. I would have to look into that. I mean, I think there's common sense in terms of how much time would be realistic, but I mean, I've had clients like literally again, the day before yesterday, a mom is fighting that because her kid totality from morning and afternoon is on a bus for 3 hours a day. So we're working to get just like a private transportation system because it's not working for him and he's wetting himself and so on and so forth. But I've heard of kids honestly being on a bus for longer than that. And I've heard parents say, my kid loves being in the car, so it's no problem for me. It calms him, it soothes him. So I feel like it's kind of a case-by-case basis. Like we have clients who I'm out in Ventura County and they go all the way out to the help group. And so that's a long ride. But, you know, it just, I would say if it's not working for your kiddo, then definitely speak up and figure something out.
Thank you. And what can parents do when they disagree with the suggested placement?
Well, that's part of parents' rights and procedural safeguards. So that should be mapped out at the end of that lovely packet you are asked if you need a copy of at probably most meetings, which you're only required to get once a year, but they probably ask you more than that. And so it lays out the process. Of course, you can disagree. So, again, California is a dual consent state. So in order for anything to move forward or be changed at all or added or removed from the IEP, it requires parental or guardian consent, right? So that's number one. So let's say they offer a change in placement to a more restrictive setting and you disagree, you can sign with exceptions on the IEP and note specifically which pieces you are not in agreement with. So in this case, let's say it's placement, in which case it would kick into a stay put, basically. And so the last agreed upon placement would continue. That can become really tricky if it's a preschool student and there is no previous placement. That's really the only time where that can be a bit of a bummer, because then the student just cannot start, right? Because there was no previous placement. And then what should happen after that is, trying to come to a resolution. So generally my experience is, districts will try to reconvene, try to talk it out a couple more times. I've seen districts leave stay put in place for years, and that's obviously not great because things get messy. Then you can go to mediation if you want. Well, you can backtrack. You can do an ADR meeting, like an alternative dispute resolution meeting with a district, and see if you can get it resolved that way. And then you get into like mediation and due process. Obviously, that would be the end of the rope in terms of kind of your options, but that's really rare. And
there was something else that you had mentioned in the past before we get to the yes, because thankfully, we have those rights if we disagree. But if they're offering something that you don't agree and you want to see what else is available, which can really be a problem for a lot of parents, like, well, what's even out there? And they're not telling you. You had mentioned that SELPAs have a listing, right, of all of the placements available?
Yeah, every SELPA should have, if you go onto your SELPA's website, they should have access to a plethora of information in terms of like, the county and within your SELPA guidelines, what's accessible and what's available. So check that out for sure. Out here, I know we also have like VCOE, the Ventura County Office of Education website, and they don't necessarily have information for every district, but they have all of the county options. So those are, obviously other programs that are available within the county for families to just be aware of. Your district website ideally should have, at least which schools have which programs as far as, special education options. So you can be aware of that as well.
And looks like Lillian was asking, isn't it true that placement doesn't really refer to a physical place or school? It's more about the type of program and services a student is receiving.
So placement and location are not one and the same, I think is what she's referring to. So placement, yes, would refer to the type of program, the LRE. So placement is either general education placement or, SDC class placement or an SDC school placement or a county program placement or non-public school, that hierarchy. Whereas location is just where that program is being offered. And so I have seen it happen a couple of times, and parents do not like this, where all of a sudden they move the student within the same campus from this teacher to this teacher, like without telling the family. And they're like, well, when did my kid's teacher change? And it's like a whole different classroom, and they'll try to argue that was a change in placement. And it's not, it's a change in location, because they're still providing the same services. They're still offering the same program. They just changed the location. And I've seen schools also, or I'm sorry, districts do that, like between schools, like, sorry, we have to move, Sarah from school A to school B. We're not changing, services, we're just changing the location. So that is.
You might want to write in your IP that they still need to tell you.
Oh yeah, for sure. Of course.
Yeah.
We definitely called them out on that. I actually get involved after, usually that's when they're like, I'm calling an advocate. But in their minds, they're thinking they changed my child's placement. And so, we have to explain, technically they didn't, they're still offering all the same services. It's still the same level of credentialed, teacher. It's just a different teacher in a different location.
Right.
So, yeah.
And then you had mentioned preschool, and I was going to ask you this, and then we actually just got another question about it too. But what is considered the least restrictive environment in preschool, especially in districts where there is no public preschool?
Yeah, preschool is tricky. So it's still protected under the law, but just kind of like you mentioned, it's a little bit different for a couple reasons. Preschool is not a mandated grade. So there's a little bit less structure, I guess, in that respect. And I kind of explained to parents, it's a little bit easier when you get to grade level in some respects because it's mandated for everyone. So in that respect, you have kind of options and accessibility to so much more, no matter where you're at, right? Because all students have to be educated by law at that age, whereas preschool is not a mandated grade. So for that reason, there are, many districts that don't even have a preschool program for general education students, let alone SPED students. And if that's the case, then they don't have to. They don't have to have a program available because they aren't offering it to gen ed students either. So when that happens, which I was sharing with you as well last week, we had a district out here where they didn't have it. So all of those students were getting referred to the county preschool program. And that was like right around the time I had opened my business. And I kind of noticed the pattern. I'm like, this just does not seem right. Like, why are all these kids being sent to this county program, like within this district? And it's a pretty, small district too. And then I figured it out, like, they don't have any preschool, let alone, so you can work to get them to send to the contract out to the nearest district that does offer the program that's necessary. Or one of the kind of nice things about preschool that I would say is harder once you're in grade school is the option for like private, funding, like the private preschool tuition, because there may not be any other options. So they have to, provide the services in the private preschool and or the home. They can also provide services in the home if it's like a daycare setting. And preschool is the only age where every IEP template is different, but it could be like a speech only IEP. So they may only get speech services and that's it. Like there is no education component. And so that can also get tricky because parents are like, well, wait a minute. So you're not offering like any classroom, but they're just going to get speech twice a week. And that is something that can occur. And obviously then it would be up to the parents, to provide access to some sort of like actual academic, program, if you will.
Got it. And Lillian had a follow-up to that. She said, so if they're in a preschool, stay put would not really mean staying in pre-K, but rather staying in the program. Kind of what you were talking about before. I think that was sort of her follow-up to if you move to another school, but it's the same placement, right? So even though it's not a change in placement, so her question was, is it stay put would not mean staying in pre-K, but rather staying in the program? Example, if it's an SDC, then they'd stay in an SDC with the same related services.
Correct.
Okay.
So it would be placement, not location. The program. So if the last agreed upon IEP was, full day SDC preschool, then that would be the offer. Let's say they changed it for a kindergarten to, just to make it simple, half and half, like 50% of the day in gen ed and 50% in SDC. And for whatever reason you had disagreement with placement, the stay put would be the full day SDC because that was the last agreed upon placement.
And we did touch on systemic issues earlier. And so if LRE is this, obviously it's this vital piece of FAPE, yet many parents, for many parents, that gen ed isn't even a consideration for their IEP team. And in fact, many families have a way easier time getting a non-private school placement than other parents have getting inclusion at their home school. So is this reality congruent with the law, or have we steered way off path from the intention of LRE? Like, how are we supposed to think about it as parents?
So when you say non-private, do you mean non-public?
Yes, non-public school.
Okay.
What am I saying? NPS, non-public school. What did I say? Non-private?
Non-private.
Non-public school, yes.
Would still be
My
public.
acronyms, I'm getting it all mixed up. It's Thursday,
Yeah.
but it really is a Friday in my head. So
Yeah. Okay. So just so I'm understanding the question, is it for some parents, it's easier to get a non-public school than is that?
Well, I guess the point of LRE was the point of LRE that children should be placed at their home school with supports as much as possible, because the reality for a lot of parents is that it's easier to get like an NPS than it is to get that gen ed placement at your home school, that it's, you know, it's such a fight. So is this the way that LRE was intended, or is this just sort of the way that it's been, right? I mean, should we be working to get closer to the law, or is the law always a great thing and this is just the way it's been interpreted or abused, or is this just the way it is, right? How are we supposed to think about it?
Oh, Lindsay. Okay. I may go on a soapbox. Well, I mean, first of all, I can't answer that question entirely because I didn't write the law. So I don't know, what was going through anyone's mind when they wrote.
Don't?
I don't. I'm sorry. I'm just not that good. No. Obviously, I mean, I think as we look at the history of the law, there have been changes, and I would argue changes for the better, such as, like we spoke to the Andrew, F case. So it's going to continue to change. I mean, it's changing and it will continue to evolve and change. And are there flaws? Absolutely. Is it because of the law in and of itself? In my personal opinion, no. I think that there are layers of problems when it comes to the implementation of the law. And I mean, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think a huge issue is that we are segregating students before we're getting to the students, because we're segregating teachers when they're getting their credential program. And to me, that is something that is huge. And if all the teachers were aligned to, like when I did my moderate to severe credential, we took, I think, maybe 2 classes with the gen ed credential teachers, and then let's say had 10 classes separate. That should be flipped, in my opinion, because how can we expect LRE, if we're going to argue that the most least restrictive environment is a gen ed class, how can we expect that to work if all these gen ed teachers are coming out into the workforce and have no idea how to support these kids? And how can we blame them when they just went through a program and they don't know how to support these kids? So I just think that there's flaws in that piece. And we can fight all day. Like, to be honest, I can help a parent fight all day to get their kid in a gen ed class. And then what? Because if that gen ed teacher doesn't know how to teach your kid, then what's, the benefit to that? And then we have to fight for these inclusion specialists, and we have to fight for all these other things. And then that takes how much more time? And then by the time we get that, they're to the next teacher, because it took half the year to get all the things in place and to get it going. And then we have to do it all over again for every teacher, because these teachers don't have the knowledge in the background. And so it's never going to work. And gen ed is never going to be the most least restrictive placement for most of these kids until those teachers are fully equipped to include our kids. That's my opinion. I don't think it's just the law and how it's written. It's also the implementation of it, right? Right.
But that's why I guess a lot of parents, they are, like you said, it might take that 6 months, but what choice do you have other than, if this is really what, your team and your, child and your family thinks is best for them, that's the point of the advocacy, just because it's just been so accepted that it's broken. So there's so much work to do.
But I think that's my point, is it shouldn't have to take that long. It shouldn't have to take 6 months, and I shouldn't have to bring 3 other people, on top of the 2 people that are already in the room to make it work, right? And it shouldn't be that way. And I don't think that's because of the way the law is written, as much as the way that we're as much as of how we are just creating these professionals and sending them out into the workforce and saying, okay, everyone fought and agreed that this kid belongs in your class, make it work. Like they need so much more support and so much more knowledge. And it's a miss in my opinion.
Yeah, there's major systems work to do before the teachers are even getting to the schools, within the schools. And then there's a huge with the training, the support, and then there's the culture.
Yeah.
So, and that's an entirely different, entirely different talk for us. So, but to wrap up, I did, we've talked about a lot, and I know I saw some questions coming in that are more general IEP questions that, we can definitely go back in, and maybe answer later that didn't really fit into exactly what we're talking about today with FAPE or LRE, but there's a lot of good questions. Either Dr. Pelangka, somebody will get in there and, definitely weigh in. But to end, what are the 3 most important things that parents should remember about FAPE? They're going into that IEP meeting, or maybe they're thinking, am I signing this? What do I think? Like, what are the 3 most important things that we need to remember about FAPE?
Oh, the 3 most important things. I mean, it's all important. I guess I would say, number 1 is just really kind of remembering and understanding that all of it collectively is FAPE. So it's not just placement. Placement in and of itself is not just FAPE. It's the IEP in its entirety and your child's program in its entirety. So the goals, the accommodations, the services, and the placement, and all of that collectively makes, FAPE what it is. To include, even extended school year and transportation. And if any one piece of that is not happening or it's flawed, that would be potentially, a violation of FAPE. And then, number 2, of course, understanding kind of what we've been talking about today as far as least restrictive environment, and really having a firm understanding of what that is, and ensuring that, your child's placement is, providing that meaningful benefit to your individual child. And of course, that doesn't mean that placement is wrong because your child isn't progressing. You have to look at all those pieces to the IEP and those pieces to the puzzle first, right? The argument can't be made based on any one, piece of the puzzle. One thing doesn't drive placement. It all collectively drives placement. And so making sure that you're kind of keeping tabs. And that's one of the biggest questions I get. Like, we have this perfectly written IEP. Now, how do I figure out if it's being implemented, right? Holding everyone accountable. Because if the team comes back and tries to push you to your child to a more restrictive setting, when at the end of the day, the real issue is they weren't really, implementing everything they should have been implementing. And that's why your child isn't progressing, then, you need to be aware of that, and that's your right, and make sure that you're holding the team accountable and your kid isn't being moved due to their errors, right? And number 3, I mean, I can't think of a third one off the top of my head. I think those are just all encompassing.
Right. I was going to say, because the first one is really, it's really looking at everything, because access is always the first thing that comes to mind, but really that's a part of 1 and 2 that you talked about, right? Looking at everything as a whole in that IEP, and knowing that it isn't just one factor. It's all of those things that have to come together to make it appropriate. And 2 was looking really at the placement, right? Looking at the placement and making sure that your child is making progress, not having your child be blamed if they're not making progress, but again, looking at that whole big picture. Let's figure out the whole purpose is that they are making purpose. They're getting educational benefit. And so if it's not working, why?
I guess a third one could be, we didn't really touch on this, but I know we've kind of been going month by month, is, again, no one piece can drive placement in and of itself. So a big one is like knowing, for parents to know, like, the offer of FAPE can't be driven by evaluation scores in and of themselves. It's, everything, like your child's performance in school, if they've been to school yet, again, excluding preschool, how they're performing in the classroom, how, they're performing on the campus. It's not just looking at evaluation scores and saying, well, they scored low, so they belong here. Like, that is not how FAPE works. And that's definitely not legal. So making sure that that's not happening to your child for sure.
Yeah, which is way too common.
Yes. Yes. That's why I'm like, wait, that's a good one.
Exactly. Very, very important point. Very important point. Well, thank you. I'm looking at the time, and unfortunately it's time to wrap up, but thank you so much, Dr. Pelangka, for taking a very vast, like, what is FAPE? It's sort of like asking, like, what's everything we need to know to make sure that our kids are getting from school what they should be getting legally, ethically, everything else.
That was Dr. Sarah Pelangka, and I hope this conversation gave you a clearer framework for understanding FAPE, LRE, and how the IEP is supposed to work, not just on paper, but in practice. If you're listening and thinking, okay, I get the concepts, but how do I apply this to my child's IEP? You don't have to figure it out alone. Undivided's IEP assistant is here to help. It's not like the regular AI that gives generic advice. It's HIPAA compliant, built with privacy and security in mind, and powered by experts. It's designed specifically for IEP documents, so you can walk into meetings feeling more prepared, informed, and confident. Try it today at www.undivided.io. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.